The midday sun hammered the flatlands of Oak Haven, a frontier settlement that seemed to exist solely to test the endurance of wood, canvas, and human patience against an unrelenting sky. Dust devils danced through the main thoroughfare, rattling the loose boards of the livery and coating the laundry lines in a permanent shade of red-brown grit, while the rest of the town huddled in the slivers of shade provided by storefront awnings, wiping sweat from their brows with grim resignation. Arthur Thorne stood a mile out, staring up at the formidable face of the Red Scar. The Scar was a massive sandstone bluff that rose abruptly from the desert floor, a geological mistake that loomed over the valley like a frozen wave of copper and rust. To most, it was an eyesore and a hazard, a place of rock slides and scorpions. To Thorne, whose hands were calloused from years of fruitless mining in veins that had long since dried up, it looked like an answer. Beside him stood Mara, her bonnet pulled low against the glare, her eyes tracking the same lines in the stone that Arthur was tracing with his finger. They were a quiet pair, bound together not just by the ring on Mara's finger, but by a shared exhaustion with the fragility of life on the flats. They had lost their first homestead to a prairie fire, and their second to a windstorm that had peeled the roof off like skin from a fruit. They were done building things that could be blown away. "The thermal mass," Arthur said, his voice raspy but steady, breaking the silence of the scrubland. "It holds the cold from the night all through the day, and in winter it holds the heat. The rock remembers, Mara. Wood forgets, but the rock remembers." He wasn't speaking with the mania of a prospector sensing gold. His tone was grounded, calculating, the voice of a man who had done the math and found the rest of the world wanting. Mara looked from the brutal sun beating down on the wilted sagebrush to the deep, inviting shadow cast by the natural overhang of the cliff face. It was a massive alcove, scooped out by wind and water over 10,000 years, sitting high enough to see the curvature of the horizon, but deep enough to swallow a house whole. "They'll say we've gone feral," Mara noted, though there was no fear in her voice, only a pragmatic assessment of their neighbors. She shifted the weight of the survey tools in her hands, her gaze lingering on the cool darkness of the cave mouth. "Let them talk," Arthur replied, turning to look at her, his expression softening as he saw the resolve in her set jaw. "We aren't building for them. We're building for the sky. We're building for the wind. We're putting the mountain between us and the weather." It was an inciting choice, bold and unconventional, born not of madness, but of a desperate, practical wisdom. They didn't want to conquer the land. They wanted to tuck themselves inside it. They walked back toward the wagon, their boots crunching on the parched earth, leaving behind the open plains for a future carved into the stone. The reaction from Oak Haven was immediate, loud, and drenched in the peculiar mockery that small communities reserve for anyone who steps outside the agreed-upon hallucinations of normalcy. The news that Arthur and Mar were hauling lumber and stone up to the Red Scar, rather than staking a claim on the fertile grasslands to the east, spread through the saloon and the sewing circles with the speed of a fever. In the dim, smoke-stained interior of the dusty spur, Mayor Pendergast held court, a glass of warm whiskey in one hand and a cigar in the other. "It's regression, purely and simply," Pendergast announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of the afternoon crowd. "Civilization is defined by straight lines, by streets, by elevation from the dirt. Thorne is taking a fine woman like Mara and dragging her back to the Stone Age. Next, they'll be wearing furs and grunting at the moon." The bar erupted in laughter, a chorus of skepticism that felt safer than curiosity. It was easier to laugh than to wonder why the mayor's own office was currently roasting like an oven, while Thorne's wagon headed toward the cool shadows. Mrs. Gable, the town's self-appointed arbiter of morality and taste, took a different angle as she watched Mara loading sacks of cement at the general store. "It's unsafe, is what it is," she whispered loudly to her companion, leaning in with the conspiratorial air of a vulture. "That rock is unstable. One good tremor and they'll be flattened like a pancake. It's pride, thinking you can burrow into God's earth like a gopher. It's not Christian living." Mara heard every word, her back stiffening as she cinched the knot on a canvas tarp. She exchanged a glance with Arthur, who was hefting a crate of iron bolts onto the wagon bed. He paused, wiping his forehead, and looked at Mrs. Gable with a calm, level gaze that made the woman flutter her fan nervously. "Safety isn't about doing what everyone else does, Mrs. Gable," Arthur said, his voice low but carrying across the silent store. "It's about understanding what you're standing on." He offered his hand to Mara, helping her up to the wagon seat. The tenderness of the gesture, his rough hand lingering on her waist, her small nod of gratitude, was a quiet defiance against the town's ridicule. As they rode out, the jeers followed them, fueled by a deep-seated fear of the unfamiliar. The townspeople needed Arthur and Mara to be wrong, because if the couple in the cliff were right, then everyone else in Oak Haven was building their lives on a mistake. Work began not with a hammer, but with a philosophy. Arthur and Mara spent the first week doing nothing but watching the light. They camped on the ledge of the Red Scar, observing how the sun moved across the sandstone face, measuring the angle of the shadows at noon, at 3, at sunset. They were applying principles of passive solar design long before the term existed, relying on the ancient geometry of the earth. They marked the floor plan with chalk directly onto the stone, a living room where the winter sun would penetrate deep to warm the floor, a pantry tucked far back into the constant 50-degree chill of the mountain's heart for food storage without ice. "The overhang is the roof," Arthur explained, pointing to the massive slab of rock jutting out 20 feet above their heads. "In the summer, the sun is high, and the lip blocks it completely. We'll be in the shade all day. In the winter, the sun drops low on the horizon, and it'll shine right under the lip to heat the house. The cliff does the work for us. They began the excavation, a grueling process of squaring off the natural cave floor. They didn't use wood for the main structure. They used stone quarried from the site itself, mortaring it with a mixture of local clay and lime. It was brutal, heavy labor. The sound of their pickaxes ringing against the sandstone became a new rhythm in the valley, a metallic heartbeat that echoed down to the town below. While Oak Haven focused on erecting hasty balloon frame houses that shook in the wind, Arthur and Mara were engaged in a conversation with geology. They built thick masonry walls to define the rooms, leaving a gap between their ceiling and the rock overhang to allow air to circulate. They installed clear-story windows, scavenging glass from abandoned claims, positioning them to catch the updraft from the canyon floor. Every decision was a negotiation with the elements. "Ventilation here," Mara said, marking a spot near the back wall where a natural fissure ran up through the rock. "If we tap into this chimney, the hot air will rise out, and it will pull the cool air from the canyon floor right through the house." It wasn't just a shelter, it was a machine made of rock and air. They worked methodically, their movements syncing up, Arthur breaking the larger stones, Mara mixing the mortar and setting the courses. They were filthy, covered in red dust that settled into the creases of their skin, but there was a growing elegance to the structure rising from the ledge, a permanence that the whitewashed slat houses in the valley could never hope to achieve. The physical toll of the construction was immense, testing the limits of their bodies and their bond. By the second month, the romance of the idea had been ground down by the reality of hauling water and cement up a narrow switchback trail. One evening, deep into September, a localized tremor sent a shower of loose shale cascading down onto their half-finished patio, smashing a crate of expensive window panes they had carted from the railhead. Mara sat amidst the shattered glass, her shoulders shaking, not with tears, but with the silent, vibrating laughter of exhaustion that teeters on the edge of a breakdown. Arthur dropped his tools and sat beside her, the dust on his face streaked with sweat. He didn't offer empty platitudes about it being okay. He simply picked up a shard of glass, turning it in the dying light. "We can use the pieces," he said softly. "Mosaic. For the entryway. It'll catch the morning light better than a clear pane anyway." Mara looked at him, seeing the fatigue etched around his eyes and the love that underpinned his stubbornness. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt scratching her cheek. "You're a stubborn old mule, Arthur Thorne," she murmured, lacing her fingers through his. "But you're my mule." They sat there as the stars came out, the vast, terrifying silence of the desert wrapping around them. This shared struggle forged something between them harder than the sandstone they were shaping. They weren't just husband and wife anymore. They were partners in a war against mediocrity. The next day, the work resumed with a renewed, almost religious intensity. They lifted beams of reclaimed timber to frame the front facade, the only part of the house that wasn't rock. They worked in a rhythm that didn't need words, a hand out for a hammer before it was asked for, a waterskin pass before the thirst became a distraction. The house grew organically, not imposed upon the land, but emerging from it. It had a rough, rugged beauty, the colors of the masonry matching the cliff so perfectly that from the town below it looked as if the mountain itself had opened an eye. It was a fortress of solitude, built on a foundation of trust in each other and the physics of the earth. By the time the first true heat wave of the following summer rolled in, the cliff house was livable, and the difference in quality of life was stark, almost cruel. Down in Oak Haven, the temperature soared to 105 degrees. The air was stagnant, shimmering off the baked clay streets. Tempers flared in the heat, fights broke out at the saloon, and the doctor was busy treating heat, exhaustion, and dehydration. Houses turned into ovens, the wood absorbing the solar radiation and radiating it inward all night, offering no respite. Up at the Red Scar, the situation was radically different. Arthur sat in his rocking chair on the stone patio, protected by the massive overhang. The thermometer on the porch read 85, but inside, deep within the thermal mass of the cliff, it was a steady, miraculous 72 degrees. Mara moved through the kitchen, which was bathed in a soft, diffused light bouncing off the canyon walls. She poured a glass of water from the clay cistern they had installed in the back fissure. The water was cool, chilled by the mountain's internal temperature. There was no need for fans, no need to strip down to undergarments and lay panting on the floor. The ventilation system worked exactly as predicted. The heat rising up the natural chimney drew a constant, gentle breeze of cool air from the shaded canyon bottom through the house. It was a sanctuary, yet the town's skepticism didn't vanish in the face of this obvious comfort. It curdled into a defensive resentment. From the valley floor, people looked up and saw the flicker of a lantern high in the cliff, a star that shouldn't be there. "It's unnatural," the mayor grumbled, wiping sweat from his neck with a sodden handkerchief. "They're up there hiding like hermits. It won't last. Wait until the big storms come. Rock falls. It always falls." The chorus of doubters grew louder to drown out the evidence of their own discomfort. They mocked the Cave of Thorn, calling it a tomb waiting to be sealed. But up on the ledge, Arthur and Mara ate their dinner in the cool quiet, watching the heat lightning flicker on the horizon, feeling a sense of peace that the town below, in its sweltering pride, could not comprehend. The seasons turned, and the cliff house began to demonstrate a mastery over time that the wooden structures below could not replicate. As autumn bled into winter, the sun's arc shifted lower in the southern sky, slipping beneath the lip of the overhang that had provided such deep shade in July. Now, those same rays reached deep into the living space, striking the flagstone floor that Arthur and Mara had painstakingly leveled and polished. During the day, the stone drank in the heat, storing it within its dense molecular structure, and when the sun vanished behind the peaks and the desert temperature plummeted to freezing, the floor released that warmth back into the room. Down in Oak Haven, the winter was a season of misery and smoke. The uninsulated walls of the shanties leaked heat like sieves, forcing families to burn through cords of expensive firewood and choke on coal fumes just to keep their water basins from freezing indoors. Dr. Caldwell, the town's weary physician, made the trek up the switchback trail one frosty afternoon to check on Mara, ostensibly out of concern for her fragile constitution living in a cave, though curiosity was the truer motive. He arrived bundled in 3 coats, his nose red and dripping, expecting to find a damp, shivering couple huddled over a pitiful fire. Instead, Dr. Caldwell stepped through the heavy oak door and stopped dead, peeling off his gloves in confusion. The air inside was not stuffy or smoky. It was crisp but distinctly warm, holding a radiant comfort that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He found Mara at her work table, mending a quilt, her fingers nimble and warm, while Arthur read by the window in nothing more than a flannel shirt. "My God," Caldwell muttered, looking around the spacious, sun-drenched room. "You're burning no coal? I don't smell it." Arthur looked up, marking his page with a strip of leather. "The sun is the furnace, Doctor. The rock is the battery. We just capture what's already there." The doctor stayed for tea, lingering far longer than necessary, basking in the physics of the place. When he returned to town, he didn't mock them, but he didn't praise them loudly either. The cognitive dissonance was too great. To admit they were right was to admit that the entire town's way of life was a folly. But the seasons didn't care about social standing. Spring arrived with violent winds that stripped shingles off the mayor's roof, while the wind simply flowed over the aerodynamic curve of the Red Scar, leaving Arthur's home untouched. The quiet sympathizers began to watch more closely, noticing that while they were constantly repairing, painting, and shoring up their fragile boxes, the couple in the cliff was simply living. But the sky was changing again, the air growing heavy and metallic, hinting at a violence that Oakhaven had not seen in a generation. The summer that followed brought a stillness that felt predatory. The heat didn't just sit, it pressed down, suffocating the valley under a lid of high pressure. The older ranchers, men with skin like cured leather who remembered the patterns of the land before the town existed, looked at the horizon with deep unease. The clouds weren't drifting, they were stacking, building vertical towers of bruised purple and charcoal gray that loomed over the mountains like gathering armies. This was the monsoon, but not the polite afternoon showers the newcomers expected. This was an atmospheric correction. Up at the cliff, Arthur stood on the patio, sniffing the air. It smelled of ozone and wet creosote, a scent that triggered a primal alert in the brain. "The pressure is dropping too fast," he told Mara, who was already bringing in the potted herbs and securing the heavy canvas shutters over the clear-story windows. They didn't panic. They prepared. Their preparation was not a frantic scramble, but the final step of a system designed years ago. They cleared the drainage channels they had cut into the rock base, deep, angled grooves designed to catch cascading water, and shoot it away from the foundation, directing it into the canyon's natural wash. In town, the reaction was a mix of denial and chaotic activity. Mayor Pendergast stood on the porch of the dusty spur, squinting at the black wall of clouds devouring the sun. "It'll blow over," he declared to a nervous crowd. "The mountains usually break it up." But Mrs. Gable was running down the street, clutching her bonnet, screaming that judgment was coming. People began nailing erratic planks over their storefront windows, a futile gesture against the magnitude of what was approaching. A young deputy rode out to the base of the cliff, shouting up at Arthur through a megaphone of cupped hands. "Thorne, you need to come down. You're too high up. The lightning will strike the rock. It's not safe." Arthur leaned over the stone parapet, his silhouette framed against the darkening sky. "The lightning wants the ground, son," he shouted back, his voice calm over the rising wind. "And the water wants the valley floor. Go to the church. It's on the highest hill in town. Don't stay in the low streets." The deputy shook his head, convinced the caveman was insane, and galloped back toward the livery. Mara joined Arthur at the rail, watching the curtain of rain obscure the distant peaks. "They won't listen," she said softly, clutching his arm. "Physics doesn't require their consent to work," Arthur replied grimly. "But I wish it did." The storm did not arrive. It collided with the earth. It began with a singular, deafening crack of thunder that shook the fillings in the townspeople's teeth, followed instantly by a deluge that felt less like rain and more like the ocean falling out of the sky. The sheer volume of water was catastrophic. In the town, the dry, hard-packed earth couldn't absorb the sudden onslaught. Within minutes, the main street, which sat in the lowest depression of the valley, transformed into a raging brown torrent. The sound was terrifying, a roar of wind tearing at roofs, mixed with the screaming of horses and the cracking of timber. The livery stable, built on a hasty foundation of dry-stacked brick, dissolved as the flash flood undercut its corners. The roof collapsed inward with a sickening crunch, sending debris swirling into the rising muck. People scrambled onto rooftops, clutching their children, watching their world liquefy beneath them. The wind, channeled by the valley walls, accelerated to hurricane speeds, ripping the awnings off the general store and turning them into deadly projectiles. High above the chaos, inside the cliff house, the experience was surreal in its contrast. The noise of the storm was present, but it was a muffled, distant drum roll, dampened by thousands of tons of sandstone. The wind screamed against the cliff face, but the aerodynamic shape of the rock forced the gale up and over the dwelling, leaving the patio in a pocket of relative calm. Arthur and Mara sat in their leather armchairs, a pot of coffee steaming on the low table between them. They weren't relaxed. Their hearts ached for the destruction they knew was happening below, but they were safe. The house was performing exactly as designed. The water cascading down the massive face of the red scar hit the diverting channels Arthur had chiseled and jetted harmlessly out to the sides, falling in magnificent waterfalls past their windows, but never entering the home. The thermal mass of the cave kept the temperature steady, while outside the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. At one point, a massive lightning bolt struck the peak of the scar above them. The ground hummed with the voltage, and the hair on Mara's arm stood up, but the current followed the path of least resistance through the wet outer rock, grounding itself miles deep, bypassing their insulated sanctuary completely. They were inside the mountain, not fighting it. They were witnessing the apocalypse of the flatlands from the belly of the beast, protected by the very geology the town had mocked. Morning brought a silence so profound it felt heavy. The sun rose over a landscape that had been scrubbed raw. The violent indigo clouds had vanished, replaced by a sky of innocent, piercing blue. Arthur and Mara stepped out onto their patio, which was dry, save for a few puddles. They looked down at Oakhaven. It was a ruin. The main street was a gash of mud and splintered lumber. The mayor's office was gone, swept completely off its foundation and deposited in pieces a quarter-mile down the wash. The church, standing on its hill as Arthur had predicted, was intact but crowded with wet, traumatized survivors. The silence broke as Arthur and Mara began the long walk down the switchback trail, carrying canteens of fresh water and bundles of dry blankets. They didn't speak of vindication. The devastation was too total for pride. As they reached the valley floor, the mud sucked at their boots, a reminder of the unstable ground the town had been built upon. They found the townspeople huddled near the ruins of the general store. Mayor Pendergast was sitting on a crate, his suit ruined, his head in his hands. Mrs. Gable was weeping softly, clutching a muddy porcelain figure, the only thing she had saved. When the crowd saw Arthur and Mara approaching, clean, dry, and carrying supplies, the atmosphere shifted. There was no jeering. No one called them primitive. The mockery had been washed away by the floodwaters. Dr. Caldwell was the first to approach, his face haggard. He looked from the wreckage of his clinic to the pristine, amber-colored facade of the cliff house high above, glowing in the morning light like a temple. "It didn't touch you," Caldwell stated, not as a question, but as a confession of fact. "Not a drop," Arthur said gently, handing a canteen to a shivering child. "The rock sheds the water, Doctor. We just stayed out of its way." Pendergast looked up, his eyes red. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrifying clarity. "We built against the land," the mayor whispered, his voice cracking. "We fought it, and we lost. You joined it." It was the turning point, the moment the social pressure crumbled under the weight of physical evidence. They didn't need to explain the thermal mass or the drainage channels in that moment. The dry blankets they were handing out were the only argument that mattered. The recovery of Oakhaven was slow, but it was different this time. The catastrophe had washed away not just the buildings, but the rigid adherence to civilized conventions that made no sense in the desert. The town didn't move into the cliffs. There wasn't room for everyone, but they stopped building wooden boxes on the floodplains. Arthur became an unwilling architect for the new settlement. He sat with the town council, not as a pariah, but as the only man who understood the language of the valley. He taught them to build with adobe and rammed earth, materials that mimicked the thermal properties of his cave. He showed them how to orient their windows to catch the winter sun and block the summer glare. He taught them that the landscape was not a blank canvas to be painted over, but a set of rules to be obeyed. Years passed, and the sharp edges of the tragedy softened into history. The cliff house remained, unchanging, a permanent fixture of the Red Scar. It became a symbol, not of eccentricity, but of wisdom. Travelers passing through would point up at the structure, blending perfectly into the rust-colored stone, and locals would tell the story not with ridicule, but with a fierce, possessive pride. "That's the Thorn place," they would say. "Safest spot in the territory. The mountain holds it." Arthur and Mara grew old in the comfort of their stone shell. Their hair turned the color of the quartz veins in the walls, and their movements slowed, but their bond with the place and each other only deepened. One evening, sitting on the patio, watching a new generation of clouds gather over the distant peaks, Mara reached out and took Arthur's hand. Her grip was frail, but her eyes were bright. "They learned, Arthur," she said softly, looking down at the town below, where the new adobe roofs glowed warm and resilient in the sunset. "It took a storm, but they learned." Arthur nodded, squeezing her hand, feeling the warmth of the sun-baked stone beneath his boots. "They learned," he agreed. "We just had to show them that the earth is only hard if you hit it. If you lean on it, it holds you up." The legacy wasn't the house itself, but the shift in perspective, a community that finally understood that true strength wasn't about conquering nature, but about having the humility to live inside it.